Hi, this is Charlie from Vintage Speed. On this video, we're going to show you how to adjust and put on the linkage if you're using our 2.2 base kit on a tripower with the Rochester 2GC small base carburetors. And I'm also going to show you how to install our fuel line kit, which is all pretty simple. Okay, the first thing you want to do is you want to put this end of the linkage in. This is called the actuator pin. You want to put your actuator pin in with your heim joint in behind like this and your washer, and you want to snug this down. Make sure that you've got this rod and your long arm 45 degrees facing forward from vertical, so that when it sweeps through the pattern, it'll pull 90 degrees to open your carburetors. Okay, first thing you want to do is you want to leave this end of the rod loose. Put your linkage in with your actuator pin on through here and snug this down and loosen it just enough that this pin rotates. You don't want it sloppy, but you just want it to rotate, because as this cams over, it needs to be able to rotate so it don't bind your linkage. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is you install your long arm on your center shaft, your extended shaft on your primary carburetor, so that it's facing forward 45 degrees from vertical, and lock it down. Make sure you put your actuator rod through the hole before you hook this end up, and then go ahead and put this end in your top hole. You always keep your linkage in the top hole on our linkage. If you try, guys will try to move it down. These holes are just cosmetic. They don't have anything to do with the operation of the linkage. Okay, so you got your actuator pin on. This is sliding through, and give me the Allen wrench for that, those little heels. And the next thing you're going to do is you're going to come back here to the rear carb arm, and what you want to do is the nut closest to the rod end locks the rod in. The nut closest to the sleeve locks the sleeve. This is a piece of 1032 stainless threaded rod that runs all the way through this stainless sleeve, and it makes for a very rigid linkage. So you have the inner lock nuts lock the sleeve on the shaft, the outer lock nuts lock your heim joint. Okay, this end's installed with the actuator pin. You got this through. This one you make sure it's on first, you can't get it on. The other one can be off, or just leave it where it's sliding. Okay, going back to this end, what you want to do is you want to adjust this rod in so that that screw goes through the linkage perfectly perpendicular. In other words, you don't want it off cattywampus. You want it to go perfectly perpendicular through the linkage. Put it in and go ahead and tighten it down snug. Then you want to, as soon as it's snug, you want to back this nut off about 3/4 of a turn. These are nylocks, so they stay where you put them. The reason for that is you need a little bit of fore and aft movement in your throttle linkage, like so. The reason for that is our bases are so precision that if one set of throttle plates closes slightly before the other set closes, what it'll do is it'll hold the other set open. Whichever set closes first will hold your other set open. You'll have leakage, and you'll get a vacuum leak through whichever carburetor is being held open. Okay, now the way the factory did this on the GM cars, that was the 348 Chevrolets, the GTOs, the Cadillacs, the Olds J2s, and all of the factory tripowers. Instead of using rod ends, they used a rod that went from your front carburetor to your back carburetor. And what that rod did, one of the carb arms was slotted instead of having a round hole, so it accomplished the same thing that we're doing with the lock nuts. Okay, so once that's on and tightened down and backed off 3/4 of a turn, you should be able to move this rod slightly forward and aft, just like that. That'll allow whichever set of throttle plates that closes first, it'll allow the second set to close. So both of your sets will close, and they're spring loaded. Okay, now you've got that on. What you want to do is you want to, it's not right. With these two locking collars loose, the way you adjust this linkage is you hold all 3 carburetors in the wide open position. Make sure that they're wide open. Sometimes it helps if you have a friend to help you do this. Make sure all 3 are wide open, and then you take your outer locking collar here, you move it up tight against your actuator pin, tight against your actuator pin, and lock it down. Snug it down. Okay, release everything back to curb idle. Make sure that your choke is wide open and not sitting on the fast idle cam, or it'll mess up your linkage adjustment. So make sure your choke's wide open on your center carburetor. Then you take this other locking collar and you move it down, and I usually leave it about 1/8 of an inch off of the locking pin. Leave just a little space in between it, and go ahead and snug that one down. This is strictly a safety. The linkage will work without it. What it does is it allows, if something should stick, you can kick your throttle pedal and kick the linkage back shut. Not that my linkage sticks, but if it should stick, you can do that. Okay, now once that's done, your linkage is adjusted, and you'll run 65% on the center carburetor, and you'll pull them open, and all 3 will reach wide open at the same time. That's just the way the linkage works right there. Okay? Now, I want to talk to you before we put that fuel line on a little bit about the way we set up our tri-powers. Okay, our end carburetors are strictly dumpers. They use either our steel or aluminum throttle bodies with the lapped and sealed throttle plates, and these are wide throttle plates, and they're cut at a 14-degree angle rather than the 6-degree angle of the standard primary plate. The reason that you can't use a primary base on your end carburetors is because the plates are too small and they won't seal. If you do jam them tight enough closed to get most of the air cut off, you can't get them back open. So these plates that are cut for these bases are basically, they're sort of egg-shaped, okay? And they have a wide flange on them, and then we lap them in so that you get a seal. These 2 carburetors should be airtight. Remember, on a good running tri-power, you want your engine to think there's only 1 carburetor sitting there. These are dumpers. They strictly come into play at high RPM. They don't do nothing but sit out there and look pretty for 90% of your driving, because you're going to be driving on this at highway speeds and around town, etc. Okay, now I want to talk to you about the way we set these up. Okay, there's no vacuum ports on your secondary bases, although I do have a provision there that if you want to drill a base and tap it, if you need additional vacuum, but we supply you with plenty of vacuum, manifold vacuum off of your primary carburetor. Now, let's talk about ported vacuum versus manifold vacuum. Personally, on all my systems, I like to run intake vacuum. In other words, what we call straight vacuum. That's the vacuum that's on the manifold itself. Ported vacuum was an emissions thing that came out on the later carburetors, and what they did is they run ported vacuum so that you didn't bring any of your advance in at idle. Personally, on the tri-power, I like to bring my advance in, so I like to run manifold vacuum. I provide you the provision on this carburetor that you can run ported vacuum or manifold vacuum. If you look down here, you're going to see there's a little cap right here. There's a little cap right there, and that's over a tube. If you want to run manifold vacuum, that goes straight through to the intake, so that would produce manifold vacuum to go back to your distributor. If you want to run ported vacuum, then you're going to run the ported vacuum signal off this port right here. This port on all of my systems are running to ported vacuum. It's true, some of the bases have used this for manifold vacuum. It just depends on how it was drilled through the base. If you get a tri-power or carburetor from me, this will always be ported vacuum, and this port right here will be manifold vacuum. This is the port to hook your crankcase ventilator up, or you can tee into that and you can hook up power brakes or whatever you need to. My advice in startup of an engine is to put a cap over these, get your engine running, get everything tuned, get it just like you want it, and then go ahead and start putting in your auxiliary vacuum sources. And the reason for that is because it just complicates matters if there's something wrong. If you've got a bad crankcase ventilator valve, which does happen, or say a check valve in a power brake booster is leaking, you'll think that it's the carburetors, and actually you'll be drawing vacuum through that port. So I like to plug that until I get everything running, and then you can screw a fitting in at either a T for your power brakes or your crankcase ventilator. Remember, the little post that's sticking up here, the little tube, which we put a cap over, that little tube right there, that's manifold vacuum. So if you're going to run manifold vacuum, you'd put your hose on there and run it around to your distributor. If you're going to run ported vacuum, you hook it up to this port right here. And by the way, if you don't use this port, you need to cap it, because if you don't, as soon as you advance your throttle, it'll start putting a vacuum signal on that port, and you'll end up with a vacuum leak. Okay, now while I'm on this side, these are standard GM linkages. We have several different styles, but they're all basically the same. Your foot pedal would hook up here, and you can use either one of these holes, or you can even put a taller hole depending on the ratio you want for your foot, either your cable or your rod, or however you're hooking your gas pedal up. This is your speed screw. This sets idle speed against this little cam that works off of here. This is your fast idle cam. Now, as you notice, when the choke is on, it elevates this cam up on these steps right here, and it increases your engine RPM when your choke's on. On most of our systems, we prefer to run manual chokes. Some instances, you won't even need a choke, but in most cases, if you do need a choke, we supply all these systems with our little custom choke bracket and a place to hook your choke cable in for your to operate your manual choke, and that would work just like that. Your cable goes in here, lays over the top of this, and would go back to your firewall. We also sell a cable, a nice little petite cable that's flat black, and it's not gaudy, and it works real good with these linkages. Okay, now we're going to go to the other side. Okay, we've got our linkage on and got our linkage adjusted, and everything's working good there. Now we're going to put our fuel lines in. When you get a system from me, a carburetor, it'll come with the fittings already in. Inside here, on all these small base Rochesters, there is a spring. Then there's a centered bronze filter that goes into the back of your fitting, and it goes in like this. You always want the open end pointed towards where your fuel's coming in. There's a gasket, a little black gasket that goes on there, and then there's a nylon ring washer that goes around the outside that seals it off. We find that these work a lot better. You don't get a lot of drips and stuff like you do with the little fiber washers. These tend to embed. If there's a scratch in there, it'll embed that material into it, and it'll seal it off, so they'll work. When you get the system, it'll come, if you get a carburetor, it'll come with the fuel inlet fittings already in it, unless you specify different, or if you want some other different type. Okay, now on the fuel line, our fuel lines are custom bent. These are T304 polished stainless aircraft tubing. They're 035 wall. They're very rigid. When you're putting your carburetors on the intake, what you want to do before you snug them down is move all your carburetors as far to the front as they'll go and tighten the bolts down. The reason for that is that you want a perfect center to center on these carburetors. Understand, the hole in the base is 3/8. The stud or the bolt is 5/16. What will happen is if you just put them on there any way you want to, you can actually turn this carburetor, and this will move 1/4 of an inch either way. You'll go to put the fuel line on there, and it won't line up. So scoot your carburetors all the way forward or all the way to the rear before you tighten your bolts down. Now, sometimes what we find the easiest way to put our fuel line on is we put our center line in first. And what you want to make sure is that it goes all the way in and bottoms out. These have a ferrule on them. These are compression fittings, and they go all the way in. So you push that all the way in tight, and you go ahead and snug that nut down. And I'll show you the reason for this, because even though the bends are very close, sometimes you have to tweak them just a little bit to get them to go in. Okay, once you get that in, here's the procedure. What you do is you take these are not completely tight. You want to leave them not loose, but just snug. The reason for that is you want to be able to rotate this fuel block. You rotate the fuel block just like that, and get this so your line's going in perfectly straight. Go ahead and put this line in. Make sure you hold in on the line. You want the line all the way bottomed out inside the fitting. All right, now once you do that, we're going to do the same thing to the other line. We slip it on like so, put your ferrule on, and what you're going to do is you're going to turn this line back in the other direction, and what you want to do is get it so it's lined up perfectly straight. Let me see here, maybe it'd be better this way. There we go. So you can change the direction of this line just by tweaking the block. Okay, once that's in and you're sure the line's pushed all the way in and bottomed out, you can go ahead and tighten this fuel line down. People ask me why we don't use flared fittings. Stainless steel, unless it's annealed, which means softened, it's very difficult to flare a stainless line. What happens is it work hardens and they want to crack. So once you get that in, then you can turn this block back till it's facing straight, and you can go ahead and tighten your other ones, your other lines back down. We've sold hundreds of these fuel lines, and they're very good. They don't leak. You don't have any problem. But if you buy a system from me and you get it in, you want to check all your lines before you hook gas to it to make sure that everything's tight. And there you have it. That should give you, I guess that's about all as far as the linkage. Remember, don't forget, always leave a little fore and aft movement in this rod. That's the most critical thing we find. We have guys call us up and say that the car won't idle, that it's running RPMs high. And the first thing mechanics do, especially, is mechanics, including myself, don't like to read instructions. And so what they'll do, they'll see that this is loose, and the first thing they'll do is they'll snug these two nuts down, and it just binds everything up. And then one set of bases will close, it'll hold the other set open. So always make sure you got that little bit of slack in there. And when you're all done, you can tighten down your inner nut, which locks your sleeve, and you can snug down your outer nuts that lock your heim joints where you put them. Our linkage is very simple, and it works excellent. Your bases snap everything back. We don't put return springs under the pumps on secondary carburetors because we find that it makes the linkage too hard. You don't really need them because you've got a torsion spring on the base which snaps the carburetor back. We do put a small spring like this under the pump on the primary carb, which gives it return. You may find that you want to put an additional spring on it, but really it's not necessary. These things snap back so good. The bottom holes on this rod right here are used if you need to hook a throttle valve cable or a kickdown cable. You can use the holes here for instance, if you're running a 700R or something that uses a TV cable, you can use the bottom holes to control that TV cable. As far as brackets goes, Locar makes a bracket that's a 4-bolt bracket that bolts under the carburetor, and the only thing bad about that is the fact that it does raise the carburetor a little bit. What we found as an alternative is you can go to any parts stores that sell Mr. Gasket, and they make a universal throttle cable, TV cable bracket, a little chrome bracket. They're actually made for a 4-barrel, and you have to trim it a little bit, but we bolt it on and put it on this back bolt in the carburetor, and it lines your cable up perfect, and then everything will fit. And that's what I've run on my cars and some of the ones we've sold, and they work real good. So there you go. And I think that pretty much tells you all you need to know about it. If you have any questions, you can call me. I'm Charlie at Vintage Speed, 772-778-0809. Or you can go on our online catalog. It's www.vintagespeed.com, and you can order any of these parts. We have a very extensive line of parts, every part and piece for the carburetor, as well as secondary bases, linkages, fuel lines. We make several different types of fuel lines. We make a high welded line that comes out of here, sweeps past this carburetor, picks up these two, and it can be bent and gone down. If you don't want this part and you just want a welded line, we make those. We also make what's called a low welded line. It comes out of the carburetors and goes down, and then these turn down and go into it, and that's also a welded line. Or you can run banjo fittings with our hoses if you want something a little more nostalgia looking, but these work real good. Also, on your oil fill tube, John, grab me the oil fill tube. Your oil fill tube, if you're installing this, the tube and the cap, and I really like these because if you don't have a bunch of accessories up on the front part of your motor, the old original oil fill tube and cap worked really great because it lets you put oil in the engine, plus it gives you an auxiliary breather. And the way these are installed is these are a press-in fit. So they go in just like that. The best way to install that is to just wipe you a little clear silicone right around the edge of it, insert it down, and lay you a little block of wood on here, and just take you a mallet and drive it in, and it'll go right in and seat, and then your cap just snaps on. They're real handy because putting oil up front here, you don't get oil all over your valve covers and running down on your headers and whatever. These are for your heater hose. If you don't want to use a heater, then you can plug these off. There is a vacuum port here for manifold vacuum. It's 1/8" pipe. If you don't use that, you can plug it. And that pretty much sums it up. Remember, ported vacuum comes out of this port right here. And ported vacuum comes in above the throttle plate. So when you're at idle, there's no vacuum or very little vacuum on this port. As you advance the throttle, it puts a vacuum signal on this port. Manifold vacuum comes in on the port that we supplied you in the back of the base. The other port in the back of the base is your heavy-duty vacuum for crankcase ventilator or power brakes. And we install a 90-degree fitting in there. If you need to put a T in it or whatever, you can plumb that in. If you're not going to use that, make sure that's plugged or it will not run, because that is corrected directly to the manifold, so it's a high vacuum source. Okay, on your water outlet, we don't put the water outlets on them because there's so many different ones. They make a little 45-degree to the forward if your radiator hose is coming out towards the middle. They make a 90-degree one that 90 degrees off to the side. They also make one that has an O-ring in it so you can turn it any direction you want. Just make sure that you use a fairly low profile one. There's plenty of room there and it shouldn't hit your carburetor, but make sure you use a low profile one. Okay, I hope this helps you guys, and if you need any parts or pieces, give me a call. And I'm Charlie, and thank you guys very much.